Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in the second half of Psychoanalysis and the Unconscious by D.H. Lawrence. We are up to Chapter 4 entitled The Child and His Mother. And with that said, I'll get started. In asserting that the seat of consciousness in a young infant is in the abdomen, we do not pretend to suggest that all the other conscious centers are utterly dormant. Once a child is born, the whole nervous and cerebral system comes awake, even the brain's memories begin to glimmer, recognition and cognition soon begin to take place. But the spontaneous control and all the prime developing activity derive from the great effective centers of the abdomen. And the solar plexus is the first great fountain and issue of infantile consciousness. There, beneath the navel, lies the active human first mind, the prime unconscious. From the moment of conception, when the first nucleus is formed, to the moment of death, when the same nucleus breaks again, the first great active center of human consciousness lies in the solar plexus. The movement of development in any creature is, however, towards a fluorescent individuality. The ample, mature, unfolded individual stands perfect in himself, but also perfect in his harmonious relation to those nearest him and to all the universe. Whilst only the one great center of consciousness is awake, in the abdomen, the infant has no separate existence. His whole nature is contained in the conjunction with the parent. As soon as the complementary negative pole arouses the voluntary center of the lumbar ganglion, there is at once a retraction into independence and an assertion of singleness. The back strengthens itself. But still the circuit of polarity, dual as it is, positive and negative from the positive sympathetic and the negative voluntary poles, still depends on the duality of two beings. It is still extra-individual. Each individual is vitally dependent on the other for the life circuit. Let us consider for a moment the kind of consciousness manifested at the two great primary centers. At the solar plexus, the new psyche acts in a mode of attractive vitalism, drawing its objective unto itself as by vital magnetism. Here it drinks in, as it were, the contiguous universe, as during the womb period it drank from the living continuum of the mother. It is darkly self-centered, exultant, and positive in its own existence. It is all in itself to itself, its own great subject. It knows no objective. It only knows its own vital potency, which potency draws the external object unto itself, subjectively as the bloodstream was drawn into the fetus by subjective attraction. Here the psyche is to itself the all, blindly self-positive. This is the first mode of consciousness for every living thing, fascinating in all young things. The second half of the same mode commences as soon as direct activity sets up in the lumbar ganglion. Then the psyche recoils upon itself, in its first reaction against continuity with the outer universe. It recoils even against its own mode of assimilatory unison. Even it must break off, interrupt the great psychic assimilation process which goes on at the sympathetic center. It must recoil clean upon itself, break loose from any attachment whatsoever. And then it must try its power, often playfully. This reaction is still subjective. When a child stiffens and draws away, when it screams with pure temper, it takes no note of that from which it recoils, and has no objective consciousness of that from which it reacts, the mother principally. It is like a swimmer endlessly kicking the water away behind him, with strong legs vividly active from the spinal ganglia. Like a man in a boat pushing off from the shore, it merely thrusts away, in order to ride free, evermore free. It is a purely subjective motion in the negative direction. After our long training in objectivation, and our epoch of worship of the objective mode, it is perhaps difficult for us to realize the strong, blind power of the unconscious on its first plane of activity. It is something quite different from what we call egoism, which is really mentally derived, for the ego is merely the sum total of what we conceive ourselves to be. The powerful, pristine subjectivity of the unconscious on its first plane is, on the other hand, the root of all our consciousness and being, darkly tenacious. Here we are grounded, say what we may. And if we break the spell of this first subjective mode, we break our own main root and live rootless, shiftless, groundless. So that the powerful subjectivity of the unconscious, where the self is all in all unto itself, active in strong, desirous psychic assimilation, or in direct repudiation of the contiguous universe, this first plane of psychic activity, polarized in the solar plexus and the lumbar ganglion of each individual, but established in a circuit with the corresponding poles of another individual, this is the first scope of life and being for every human individual, and is beyond question. But we must again remark that the whole circuit is established between two individuals, that neither is a free thing unto itself, and that the very fact of established polarity between the two maintains that correspondence between the individual entity and the external universe which is the clue to all growth and development. The pure subjectivity of the first plane of consciousness is no more selfish than the pure objectivity of any other plane. How can it be? How can any form of pure, balanced polarity between two vital individuals be in any sense selfish on the part of one individual? We have got our moral values all wrong. Save for healthy instinct, the moralistic human race would have exterminated itself long ago. And yet man must be moral, at the very root, moral. The essence of morality is the basic desire to preserve the perfect correspondence between the self and the object, to have no trespass and no breach of integrity, nor yet any revolture in the vitalistic interchange. As yet we see the unconscious active on one plane only and entirely dependent on two individuals. But immediately following the establishment of the circuit of the powerful, subjective, abdominal plane comes the quivering of the whole system into a new degree of consciousness, and two great upper centers are awake. The diaphragm really divides the human body psychically as well as organically. The two centers beneath the diaphragm are centers of dark subjectivity, centripetal, assimilative. Once these are established in the thorax, the first two centers of objective consciousness become active, with ever-increasing intensity. The great thoracic sympathetic plexus rouses like a sun in the breast. The thoracic ganglion fills the shoulders with strength. There are now two planes of primary consciousness. The first, the lower, the subjective unconscious, active beneath the diaphragm, and the second, upper, objective plane, active above the diaphragm in the breast. Let us realize that the subjective and objective of the unconscious are not the same as the subjective and objective of the mind. Here we have no concepts to deal with, no static objects in the shape of ideas. We have none of that tiresome business of establishing the relation between the mind and its own ideal object, or the discriminating between the ideal thing in itself and the mind of which it is the content. We are spared that hateful thing in itself, the idea which is at once so all-important and so nothing. We are on straightforward, solid ground. There is no abstraction. The unconscious subjectivity is, in its positive manifestation, a great imbibing, and in its negative, a definite blind rejection, what we call an unconscious rejection. This subjectivity embraces alike creative emotion and physical function. It includes alike the sweet and untellable communion of love between the mother and child, the irrational reaction into separation between the two, and also the physical functioning of sucking and urination. Psychic and physical development run parallel, though they are forever distinct. The child sucking, the child urinating, this is the child acting from the great subjective centers, positive and negative. When the child sucks, there is a sympathetic circuit between it and the mother, in which the sympathetic plexus in the mother acts as negative or submissive pole to the corresponding plexus in the child. In urination, there is a corresponding circuit in the voluntary centers, so that a mother seems gratified, and is gratified inevitably by the excremental functioning of her child. She experiences a true polar reaction. Child and mother have in the first place no objective consciousness of each other, and certainly no idea of each other. Each is a blind desideratum to the other. The strong love between them is effectual in the great abdominal centers, where all love, real love, is primarily based. Of that reflected or moon love, derived from the head, that spurious form of love which predominates today, we do not speak here. It has its root in the idea. The beloved is a mental objective, endlessly appreciated, criticized, scrutinized, exhausted. This has nothing to do with the active unconscious. Having realized that the unconscious sparkles, vibrates, travels in a strong subjective stream from the abdominal centers, connecting the child directly with the mother at corresponding poles of vitalism, we realize that the unconscious contains nothing ideal, nothing in the least conceptual, and hence nothing in the least personal, since personality, like the ego, belongs to the conscious or mental subjective self. So the first analyses are, or should be, so impersonal that the so-called human relations are not involved. The first relationship is neither personal nor biological, a fact which psychoanalysis has not succeeded in grasping. For example, a child screams with terror at the touch of fur. Another child loves the touch of fur and purrs with pleasure. How now? Is it a complex? Did the father have a beard? It is possible, but all too human. The physical result of rubbing fur is to set up a certain amount of frictional electricity. Frictional electricity is one of the sundering forces. It corresponds to the voluntary forces exerted at the lower spinal ganglia, the forces of anger and retraction into independence and power. An oversympathetic child will scream with fear at the touch of fur. A refractory child will purr with pleasure. It is a reaction which involves even deeper things than sex, the primal constitution of the elementary psyche. A sympathetically overbalanced child has a horror of the electrical friction force such as it is emitted from the fur of a black cat, creature of rapacity. The same delights a fierce-willed child. But we must admit at the same time that from earliest days, a child is subject to the definite conscious psychic influences of its surroundings, and will react almost automatically to a conscious passional suggestion from the mother. In this way, personal sex is prematurely evoked, and real complexes are set up. But these derive not from the spontaneous unconscious. They are in a way dictated from the deliberate mental consciousness, even if involuntarily. Again, they are a result of mental subjectivity, self-consciousness, so different from the primal subjectivity of the unconscious. To return, however, to the pure unconscious, when the upper centers flash awake, a whole new field of consciousness and spontaneous activity is opened out. The great sympathetic plexus of the breast is the heart's mind. This thoracic plexus corresponds directly in the upper man to the solar plexus in the lower, but it is a correspondence in creative opposition. From the sympathetic center of the breast, as from a window, the unconscious goes forth seeking its object to dwell upon it. When a child leans its breast against its mother, it becomes filled with a primal awareness of her, not of itself desiring her or partaking of her, but of her as she is in herself. This is the first great acquisition of primal objective knowledge, the objective content of the unconscious. Such knowledge we call the treasure of the heart. When the ancients located the first seat of consciousness in the heart, they were neither misguided nor playing with metaphor. For by consciousness they meant, as usual, objective consciousness only. And from the cardiac plexus goes forth that strange effluence of the self, which seeks and dwells upon the beloved, lovingly roving like the fingers of an infant or a blind man over the face of the treasured object, gathering her mold into itself, and transferring her mold forever into its own deep unconscious psyche. This is the first acquiring of objective knowledge, sightless, unspeakably direct. It is a dwelling of the child's unconscious within the form of the mother, the gathering of a pure eternal impression. So the soul stores itself with dynamic treasures. It verily builds its own tissue of such treasure, the tissue of the developing body, each cell stored with creative dynamic content. The breasts themselves are as two eyes. We do not know how much the nipples of the breast, both in man and woman, serve primarily as poles of vital conscious effluence and connection. We do not know how the nipples of the breast are as fountains leaping into the universe, or as little lamps irradiating the contiguous world to the soul in quest. But certainly from the passional conscious center of the breast goes forth the first joyous discovery of the beloved, the first objective discovery of the contiguous universe, the first ministration of the self to that which is beyond the self. So functionally the mother ministers with the milk of her breast. But this is a yielding to the great lower plexus, the basic solar plexus. It is the breast as part also of the elementary system, a special thing. In sucking, the hands also come awake. It is strange to notice the pictures by the old masters of the Madonna and Child. Sometimes the strange round belly of the infant seems the predominant mystery center, and sometimes from the tiny breast it is as if a delicate light glowed, the light of love, as if the breast should illumine the outer world in its seeking administering love, as if the breast of the infant glimmered its light of discovery on the adoring mother, and she bowed submissive to the revelation. The little hands and arms wave, circulate, trying to touch, to grasp, to know. To grasp and caress, not to reave. To grasp in order to identify themselves with the cherished discovery, to realize the beloved. To cherish, to realize the beloved. To administer the outward seeking self to the beloved. We give this the exclusive name of love. But it is indeed only the one direction of love, the outgoing from the lovely center of the breast, the nipples seeking, the hands delicately, caressively exploring, the eyes at last waking to perception. The eyes, the hands, these wake and are alert from the center of the breast. But the ears and feet move from the deep lower centers, the recipient's ears, imbibing vibrations, the feet which press the resistant earth, controlled from the powerful lower ganglia of the spine. And thus great scope of activity opens in the hands that wave and explore, the eyes that try to perceive, the legs, the little knees that thrust away, the small feet that curl and twinkle upon themselves, ready for the obstinate earth. And so, also a wholeness is established within the individual. The two fields of consciousness, the first upper and the first lower, are based upon a correspondence of polarity. The first great complex circuit is now set up within the individual, between the upper and lower centers. The individual consciousness has now its own integral independent existence and activity, apart from the external connection. It has its right to be alone. Chapter 5. The Lover and the Beloved. Consciousness develops on successive planes. On each plane there is the dual polarity, positive and negative, of the sympathetic and voluntary nerve centers. The first plane is established between the poles of the sympathetic solar plexus and the voluntary lumbar ganglion. This is the active first plane of the subjective unconscious, from which the whole of consciousness arises. Immediately succeeding the first plane of subjective dynamic consciousness arises the corresponding first plane of objective consciousness, the objective unconscious polarized in the cardiac plexus and the thoracic ganglion in the breast. There is a perfect correspondence and difference between the first abdominal and the first thoracic planes. These two planes polarize each other in a fourfold polarity, which makes the first great field of individual, self-dependent consciousness. Each pole of the active unconscious manifests a specific activity and gives rise to a specific kind of dynamic or creative consciousness. On each plane, the negative voluntary pole complements the positive sympathetic pole, and yet the consciousness originating from the complementary poles is not merely negative versus positive. It is categorically different, opposite. Each is pure and perfect in itself. But the moment we enter into the two planes of corresponding consciousness, lower and upper, we find a whole new range of complements. The upper dynamic objective plane is complementary to the lower dynamic subjective. The mystery of creative opposition exists all the time between the two planes, and this unison and opposition between the two planes forms the first whole field of consciousness. Within the individual, the polarity is fourfold. In a relation between two individuals, the polarity is already eightfold. Now, before we can make any sort of scientific, comprehensive psychology, we shall have to establish the nature of the consciousness at each of the dynamic poles. The nature of the consciousness, the direction of the dynamic vital flow, the resultant physical organic development and activity. This we must do before we can even begin to consider a genuine system of education. Education now is widely at sea, having ceased to steer by the pole star of the mind, having ceased to aim at the cramming of the intellect, it veers hither and thither hopelessly and absurdly. Education can never become a serious science until the human psyche is properly understood. And the human psyche cannot begin to be understood until we enter the dark continent of the unconscious. Having begun to explore the unconscious, we find we must go from center to center, chakra to chakra, to use an old esoteric word. We must patiently determine the psychic manifestation at each center, and moreover, as we go, we must discover the psychic results of the interaction, the polarized interaction between the dynamic centers both within and without the individual. Here is a real job for the scientist, a job which eternity will never see finished, though even tomorrow may see it well begun. It is a job which will at last free us from the most hateful of all shackles, the shackles of ideas and ideals. It is a great task of the liberators, those who work forever for the liberation of the free, spontaneous psyche, the effective soul. In these few chapters we hope to hint at the establishment of the first field of the unconscious, at the nature of the consciousness manifested at each pole, and at the already complex range of dynamic polarity between the various poles. So far we have given the merest suggestion of the nature of the first plane of the unconscious, and have attempted the opening of the second or upper plane. We profess no scientific exactitude, particularly in terminology. We merely wish intelligibly to open a way. To balance the solar plexus wakes the great plexus of the breast. In our era, this plexus is the great planet of our psychic universe. In the previous sympathetic era, the flower of the universal blossomed in the navel. But since Egypt, the sun of creative activity beams from the breast, the heart of the supreme man. This is to us the source of light, the loving heart, the sacred heart. Against this we contrast the devouring darkness of the lower man, the devouring whirlpool beneath the navel. Even theosophists don't realize that the universal lotus really blossoms in the abdomen, that our lower man, our dark devouring whirlpool, was once the creative source in human estimation. But in calling the heart the sun, the source of light, we are biologically correct even, for the roots of vision are in the cardiac plexus. But if we were to consider the heart itself, not its great nerve plexus, we should have to go further than the nervous system. If we had to consider the whole lambent bloodstream, we should have to descend too deep for our unpracticed minds. Suffice it here to hint that the solar plexus is the first and main clue to the great elementary sexual activity in man, an activity at once functional and creatively emotional, whilst the cardiac plexus is first and main clue to the respiratory system and the active productive manifestations. The mouth and nostrils are gates to each great center, upper and lower. Even the breasts have this duality. Yet the clue to respiration and hand activity and vision is in the breast, while the clue to alimentation and passion and sex is in the lower centers. The duality goes so far and is so profound, and the polarity. The great organs, as well as the lymphatic glands, depend on each its own specific center of the unconscious. Each is derived from a specific dynamic conscious clue, what we might almost call a soul cell. The inherent unconscious, or soul, is the first nucleus subdivided, and from its own subdivisions produced, from its own still creative constellated nuclei, the organs, glands, nerve centers of the human organism. This is our answer to materialism and idealism alike. The nuclear unconscious brought forth organs and consciousness alike, and the great nuclei of the unconscious still lie active in the great living nerve centers, which nerve centers, from the original solar plexus to the conclusive brain, form one great chain of dual polarity and amplified consciousness. All this is a mere incoherent stammering, broken first words. To return to the direct path of our progress, it is not merely a metaphor to call the cardiac plexus the sun, the light. It is metaphor in the first place because the conscious effluence which proceeds from the first upper center in the breast goes forth and plays upon its external object, as phosphorescent waves might break upon a ship and reveal its form. The transferring of the objective knowledge to the psyche is almost the same as vision. It is root vision. It happens before the eyes open. It is the first tremendous mode of apprehension, still dark, but moving towards light. It is the eye in the breast. Psychically, it is basic objective apprehension. Dynamically, it is love, devotional, administering love. Now, we make already a discrimination between the two natures, even of the first upper consciousness. First, from the breast flows the devotional self-outpouring of love, love which gives its all to the beloved, and back again returns to the ingathered objective consciousness, the first objective content of the psyche. This argues the dual polarity. From the positive pole of the cardiac plexus flows out that effluence which we call selfless love. It is really self-devoting love, not selfless. This is the one form of love we recognize. That from the strong ganglion of the shoulders proceeds the negative circuit, which searches and explores the beloved, bringing back pure objective apprehension, not critical in the mental sense, and yet passionately discriminative. Let us discriminate between the two upper poles. From the sympathetic heart goes forth pure administering, like sunbeams. But from the strong thoracic center of the shoulders is exerted a strong rejective force, a force which, pressing upon the object of attention in the mode of separation, succeeds in transferring to itself the impression of the object to which it has attended. This is the other half of devotional love, perfect knowledge of the beloved. Now, this knowledge in itself argues a contradistinction between the lover and the beloved. It is the very mold of the contradistinction. It is the impress upon the lover of that which was separate from him, resistant to him, in the beloved. Objective knowledge is always of this kind, a knowledge based on unchangeable difference, a knowledge truly of the gulf that lies between the two beings nearest to each other. In two kinds, then, consists the activity of the unconscious on the first upper plane. Primal is the blissful sense of ineffable transfusion with the beloved, which we call love, and of which our era has perhaps enjoyed the full. It is a mode of creative consciousness essentially objective, but yet it preserves no object in the memory. It is like a great objective flux, a streaming forth of the self in blissful departure, like sunbeams streaming. If this activity alone worked, then the self would utterly depart from its own integrity. It would pass out and merge with the beloved, which passing out and merging is the goal of enthusiasts. But living beings are kept integral by the activity of the great negative pole. From the thoracic ganglion also the unconscious goes forth in its quest of the beloved. But what does it go to seek? Real objective knowledge. It goes to find out the wonders which itself does not contain, and to transfer these wonders, as by impress, into itself. It goes out to determine the limits of its own existence also. This is the second half of the activity of upper or selfless or spiritual love. There is a tremendous great joy in exploring and discovering the beloved. For what is the beloved? She is that which I myself am not. Knowing the breach between us, the unclosable gulf, I in the same breath realize her features. In the first mode of the upper consciousness there is perfect surpassing of all sense of division between the self and the beloved. In the second mode, the very discovery of the features of the beloved contains the full realization of the irreparable or unsurpassable gulf. This is objective knowledge, as distinct from objective emotion. It contains always the element of self-amplification, as if the self were amplified by knowledge in the beloved. It should also contain the knowledge of the limits of the self. So it is with the infant. Curious indeed is the look on the face of the Holy Child in Leonardo's pictures, in Botticelli's even, in the beautiful Filippo Lippi. It is the mother who crosses her hands on her breast in supreme acquiescence, recipient. It is the child who gazes with a kind of objective, strangely discerning, deep apprehension of her, startling to northern eyes. It is a gaze by no means of innocence, but of profound pre-visual discerning. So plainly is the child looking across the gulf and fixing the gulf by very intentiveness of pre-visual apprehension, that instinctively the ordinary northerner finds him antipathetic. It seems almost a cruel objectivity. Perhaps between lovers in the objective way of love, either the voluntary separative mode predominates, or the sympathetic mode of communion, one or the other. In the north we have worshipped the latter mode, but in the south it is different. The objective, sapient manner of love seems more natural. Moreover, in the face of the infant lingers nearly always the dark look of the pristine mode of consciousness, the powerful self-centering subjective mode, established in the lower body, the so-called sensual mode. But take our own children. A small infant, as soon as it really begins to direct its attention. How often it seems to be gazing across a strange distance at the mother. What a curious look is on its face, as if the mother were an object set across a far gulf, distinct, however, discernible, even obtrusive in her need to be apprehended. A mother will chase away this look with kisses, but she cannot chase away the inevitable effluence of separatist objective apprehension. She herself sometimes will fall into a half-trance, and the child on her lap will resolve itself into a strange and separate object. She does not criticize or analyze him. She does not even perceive him. But as if rapt, she apprehends him lying there, an unfathomable, inscrutable objective, outside herself, never to be grasped or included in herself. She seizes, as it were, a sudden and final objective impression of him, and the conclusive sensation is one of finality. Something final has happened to her. She has the strange sensation of unalterable certainty, a sensation at once profoundly gratifying and rather appalling. She possesses something, a certain entity of primal pre-conscious knowledge. Let the child be what he may, her knowledge of him is her own, forever and final. It gives her a sense of wealth and possession and of power. It gives her a sense also of fatality. From the very satisfaction of the objective finality derives the sense of fatality. It is a knowledge of the other being, but a knowledge which contains at the same time a final assurance of the eternal and unsuperable gulf which lies between two beings, the isolation of the self first. Thus the first plane of the upper consciousness, the outgoing, the sheer and unspeakable bliss of the sense of union, communion, at oneness with the beloved, and then the complementary objective realization of the beloved, the realization of that which is apart, different. This realization is like riches to the objective consciousness. It is, as it were, the adding of another self to the own self, through the mode of apprehension. Through the mode of dynamic objective apprehension, which in our day we have gradually come to call imagination, a man may in his time add unto himself the whole of the universe, by increasing pristine realization of the universe. This in mysticism is called the progress to infinity. That is, in the modern, truly male mysticism. The older female mysticism means something different by the infinite. But anyhow, there it is. The attaining to the infinite, about which the mystics have rhapsodized, is a definite process in the developing unconscious, but a process in the development only of the objective apprehensive centers, an exclusive process naturally. A soul cannot come into its own through that love alone which is unison. If it stress the one mode, the sympathetic mode beyond a certain point, it breaks its own integrity and corruption sets in the living organism. On both planes of love, upper and lower, the two modes must act complementary to one another, the sympathetic and the separatist. It is the absolute failure to see this that has torn the modern world into two halves, the one half warring for the voluntary, objective, separatist control, the other for the pure sympathetic. The individual psyche divided against itself divides the world against itself, and an unthinkable progress of calamity ensues unless there be a reconciliation. The goal of life is the coming to perfection of each single individual. This cannot take place without the tremendous interchange of love from all the four great poles of the first, basic field of consciousness. There must be the twofold passionate flux of sympathetic love, subjective abdominal and objective devotional, both. And there must be the twofold passional circuit of separatist realization, the lower vital self-realization, and the upper intense realization of the other, a realization which includes a recognition of abysmal otherness. To stress any one mode, any one interchange, is to hinder all, and to cause corruption in the end. The human psyche must have strength and pride to accept the whole fourfold nature of its own creative activity. Chapter 6. Human Relations and the Unconscious. The aim of this little book is merely to establish the smallest foothold in the swamp of vagueness which now goes by the name of the unconscious. At last we form some sort of notion what the unconscious actually is. It is that active spontaneity which rouses in each individual organism at the moment of fusion of the parent nuclei, and which, in polarized connection with the external universe, gradually evolves or elaborates its own individual psyche and corpus, bringing both mind and body forth from itself. Thus it would seem that the term unconscious is only another word for life. But life is a general force, whereas the unconscious is essentially single and unique in each individual organism. It is the active, self-evolving soul bringing forth its own incarnation and self-manifestation, which incarnation and self-manifestation seem to be the whole goal of the unconscious soul, the whole goal of life. Thus it is that the unconscious brings forth not only consciousness, but tissue and organs also. And all the time the working of each organ depends on the primary spontaneous conscious center of which it is the issue, if you like, the soul center. And consciousness is like a web woven finely in the mind from various silken strands spun forth from the primal center of the unconscious. But the unconscious is never an abstraction, never to be abstracted. It is never an ideal entity. It is always concrete. In the very first instance, it is the glinting nucleus of the ovule, and proceeding from this, it is the chain or constellation of nuclei which derive directly from this first spark. And further still, it is the great nerve centers of the human body, in which the primal and pristine nuclei still act direct. The nuclei are centers of spontaneous consciousness. It seems as if their bright grain were germ consciousness, consciousness germinating forever. If that is a mystery, it is not my fault. Certainly it is not mysticism. It is obvious, demonstrable scientific fact, to be verified under the microscope and within the human psyche, subjectively and objectively both. Of course, the subjective verification is what men kick at. Thin-minded idealists cannot bear any appeal to their bowels of comprehension. We can quite tangibly deal with the human unconscious. We trace its source and centers in the great ganglia and nodes of the nervous system. We establish the nature of the spontaneous consciousness at each of these centers. We determine the polarity and the direction of the polarized flow. and from this we know the motion and individual manifestation of the psyche itself. We also know the motion and rhythm of the great organs of the body. For at every point, psyche and functions are so nearly identified that only by holding our breath can we realize their duality and identification, a polarized duality once more. But here is no place to enter the great investigation of the duality and polarization of the vital creative activity and the mechanico-material activity. The two are two in one, a polarized quality. They are unthinkably different. On the first field of human conscious, the first plane of the unconscious, we locate four great spontaneous centers, two below the diaphragm, two above. These four centers control the four greatest organs, and they give rise to the whole basis of human consciousness. Functional and psychic at once, this is their first polar duality. But the polarity is further. The horizontal division of the diaphragm divides man forever into his individual duality, the duality of the upper and lower man, the two great bodies of upper and lower consciousness and function. This is the horizontal line. The vertical division between the voluntary and the sympathetic systems, the line of division between the spinal system and the great plexus system of the front of the human body, forms the second distinction into duality. It is the great difference between the soft, recipient front of the body and the wall of the back. The front of the body is the live end of the magnet. The back is the closed opposition. And again, there are two parallel streams of function and consciousness, vertically separate now. This is the vertical line of division, and the horizontal line and the vertical line form the cross of all existence and being. And even this is not mysticism, no more than the ancient symbols used in botany or biology. On the first field of human consciousness, which is the basis of life and consciousness, are the four first poles of spontaneity. These have their fourfold polarity within the individual, again figured by the cross. But the individual is never purely a thing by himself. He cannot exist save in polarized relation to the external universe, a relation both functional and psychic dynamic. Development takes place only from the polarized circuits of the dynamic unconscious, and these circuits must be both individual and extra-individual. There must be the circuit of which the complementary pole is external to the individual. That is, in the first place, there must be the other individual. There must be a polarized connection with the other individual, or even other individuals. On the first field there are four poles in each individual, so that the first, the basic field of extra-individual consciousness, contains 8 poles, an eightfold polarity, a fourfold circuit. It may be that between two individuals, even mother and child, the polarity may be established only fourfold, a dual circuit. It may be that one circuit of spontaneous consciousness may never be fully established. This means for a child a certain deficiency in development, a psychic inadequacy. So we are again face to face with the basic problem of human conduct. No human being can develop save through the polarized connection with other beings. This circuit of polarized unison precedes all mind and all knowing. It is anterior to and ascendant over the human will. And yet the mind and the will can both interfere with the dynamic circuit. An idea, like a stone wedged in a delicate machine, can arrest one whole process of psychic interaction and spontaneous growth. How then? Man doth not live by bread alone. It is time we made haste to settle the bread question, which after all is the only ABC of social economies, and proceeded to devote our attention to this much more profound and vital question: how to establish and maintain the circuit of vital polarity from which the psyche actually develops, as the body develops from the circuit of alimentation and respiration. We have reached the stage where we can settle the alimentation and respiration problems almost offhand. But woe betide us, the unspeakable agony we suffer from the failure to establish and maintain the vital circuits between ourselves and the effectual correspondent, the other human being, other human beings, and all the extraneous universe. The tortures of psychic starvation, which civilized people proceed to suffer once they have solved for themselves the bread and butter problem of alimentation, will not bear thought. Delicate, creative desire, sending forth its fine vibrations in search of the true pole of magnetic rest in another human being or beings, how it is thwarted, insulated by a whole set of India rubber ideas and ideals and conventions, till every form of perversion and death desire sets in. How can we escape neuroses? Psychoanalysis won't tell us. But a mere shadow of understanding of the true unconscious will give us the hint. The amazingly difficult and vital business of human relationship has been almost laughably underestimated in our epoch. All this nonsense about love and unselfishness, more crude and repugnant than savage fetish worship. Love is a thing to be learned through centuries of patient effort. It is a difficult, complex maintenance of individual integrity throughout the incalculable processes of interhuman polarity. Even on the first great plane of consciousness, 4 prime poles in each individual, 4 powerful circuits possible between 2 individuals, and each of the 4 circuits to be established to perfection and yet maintained in pure equilibrium with all the others. Who can do it? Nobody. Yet we have all got to do it, or else suffer ascetic tortures of starvation and privation, or of distortion and overstrain and slow collapse into corruption. The whole of life is one long, blind effort at one established polarity with the outer universe, human and non-human, and the whole of modern life is a shrieking failure. It is our own fault. The actual evolution of the individual psyche is a result of the interaction between the individual and the outer universe. Which means that just as a child in the womb grows as a result of the parental bloodstream which nourishes the vital quick of the fetus, so does every man and woman grow and develop as a result of the polarized flux between the spontaneous self and some other self or selves. It is the circuit of vital flux between itself and another being or beings which brings about the development and evolution of every individual psyche and physique. This is a law of life and creation, from which we cannot escape. Ascetics and voluptuaries both try to dodge this main condition, and both succeed perhaps for a generation. But after 2 generations, all collapses. Man doth not live by bread alone. He lives even more essentially from the nourishing creative flow between himself and another or others. This is the reality of the extra-individual circuits of polarity, those established between 2 or more individuals. But a corresponding reality is that of the internal, purely individual polarity, the polarity within a man himself of his upper and lower consciousness, and his own voluntary and sympathetic modes. Here is a 4-fold interaction within the self, and from this 4-fold reaction with the self results that final manifestation, which we know as mind, mental consciousness. The brain is, if we may use the word, the terminal instrument of the dynamic consciousness. It transmutes what is a creative flux into a certain fixed cipher. It prints off like a telegraph instrument the glyphs and graphic representations which we call percepts, concepts, ideas. It produces a new reality, the ideal. The idea is another static entity, another unit of the mechanical active and materiostatic universe. It is thrown off from life, as leaves are shed from a tree, or as feathers fall from a bird. Ideas are the dry, unliving, and scutient plumage which intervenes between us and the circumambient universe, forming at once an insulator and an instrument for the subduing of the universe. The mind is the instrument of the instruments. It is not a creative reality. Once the mind is awake, being in itself is a finality. It feels very assured. The Word became flesh and began to put on airs, says Norman Douglas wittily. It is exactly what happens. Mentality, being automatic in its principle like the machine, begins to assume life. It begins to affect life, to pretend to make and unmake life. In the beginning was the Word. This is the presumptuous masquerading of the mind. The Word cannot be the beginning of life. It is the end of life, that which falls shed. The mind is the dead end of life. but it has all the mechanical force of the non-vital universe. It is a great dynamo of supermechanical force. Given the will as accomplice, it can even arrogate its machine motions and automizations over the whole of life, till every tree becomes a clipped teapot and every man a useful mechanism. So we see the brain like a great dynamo and accumulator, accumulating mechanical force and presuming to apply this mechanical force control to the living unconscious, subjecting everything spontaneous to certain machine principles called ideals or ideas. And the human will assists in this humiliating and sterilizing process. We don't know what the human will is, but we do know that it is a certain faculty belonging to every living organism, the faculty for self-determination. It is a strange faculty of the soul itself, for its own direction. The will is indeed the faculty which every individual possesses from the very moment of conception for exerting a certain control over the vital and automatic processes of his own evolution. It does not depend originally on mind. Originally, it is a purely spontaneous control factor of the living unconscious. It seems as if, primarily, the will and the conscience were identical in the pre-mental state. It seems as if the will were given as a great balancing faculty, the faculty whereby automization is prevented in the evolving psyche. The spontaneous will reacts at once against the exaggeration of any one particular circuit of polarity, any vital circuit, a fact known to psychoanalysis. And against this automatism, this degradation from the spontaneous vital reality into the mechanic material reality, the human soul must always struggle. And the will is the power which the unique self possesses to right itself from automatism. Sometimes, however, the free psyche really collapses, and the will identifies itself with an automatic circuit. Then a complex is set up, a paranoia, then incipient madness sets in. If the identification continues, the derangement becomes serious. There may come sudden jolts of dislocation of the whole psychic flow, like epilepsy, or there may come any of the known forms of primary madness. The second danger is that the will shall identify itself with the mind and become an instrument of the mind. The same process of automatism sets up, only now it is slower. The mind proceeds to assume control over every organic psychic circuit. The spontaneous flux is destroyed, and a certain automatic circuit substituted. Now an automatic establishment of the psyche must, like the building of a machine, proceed according to some definite fixed scheme, based upon certain fixed principles. And it is here that ideals and ideas enter. They are the machine plan and the machine principles of an automatized psyche. So humanity proceeds to derange itself, to automatize itself from the mental consciousness. It is a process of derangement, just as the fixing of the will upon any other primary process is a derangement. It is a long, slow development into madness. Quite justly do the advanced Russian and French writers acclaim madness as a great goal. It is the genuine goal of self-automatism, mental conscious supremacy. True, we must all develop into mental consciousness. But mental consciousness is not a goal, it is a cul-de-sac. It provides us only with endless appliances, which we can use for the all too difficult business of coming to our spontaneous creative fullness of being. It provides us with means to adjust ourselves to the external universe. It gives us further means for subduing the external material-mechanical universe to our great end of creative life. And it gives us plain indications of how to avoid falling into automatism. Hence for the applying of the will, the loosening of false automatic fixations, the brave adherence to a profound soul impulse. This is the use of the mind, a great indicator and instrument. The mind as author and director of life is anathema. So the few things we have to say about the unconscious end for the moment. There is almost nothing said, yet it is a beginning. Still remain to be revealed the other great centers of the unconscious. We know 2 pairs. In all there are 7 planes. That is, there are 6 dual centers of spontaneous polarity, and then the final one. That is, the great upper and lower consciousness is only just broached. The further heights and depths are not even hinted at. Nay, in public it would hardly be allowed us to hint at them. There is so much to know, and every step of the progress in knowledge is a death to the human idealism which governs us now so ruthlessly and vilely. It must die, and we will break free. But what tyranny is so hideous as that of an automatically ideal humanity? This is the end of Psychoanalysis and the Unconscious by D.H. Lawrence. Thank you for listening.